January 28th, 1945. A wet heat clings to the air outside Meiktila, thick enough to taste. The monsoon has eased, but the ground still breathes mud. Inside a dim Japanese field headquarters, a lantern flickers against warped bamboo walls. Sweat drips onto paper. Maps curl at the edges. The smell of damp canvas mixes with the sour odor of uniforms worn too long in retreat. A radio crackles, static first. Then a clipped voice pushes through, strained, breathless. Reports of British Indian armor breaking through the western approaches. Engines where engines should not be. Tracks cutting across ground once believed impassable. An officer leans in, hands trembling. He tries to steady his pencil, but the sweat won't let it. He writes the message down anyway. Every stroke feels heavier than the last. Outside, a distant thump rolls across the plains. Another artillery strike. Closer than yesterday. The officers exchange a glance. Brief, unspoken, edged with something they have not admitted aloud. Fear. The radio crackles again, a phrase none of them expected to hear this soon. Meiktila threatened. A young lieutenant swallows hard. His throat clicks in the silence. Because what they said next would reveal far more than panic. It would expose everything. The struggle for Burma began long before the officers in Meiktila felt the ground shifting beneath them. When Japan seized the country in 1942, it secured more than territory. Burma was a lifeline. Its ports, its roads, its position between India and China. Holding it meant shielding the flank of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Losing it would expose Japan's southern empire to a slow, unstoppable collapse. Tokyo understood this. So did every general sent to defend it. The terrain itself seemed to favor Japan. Jungles thick enough to swallow entire regiments. Rivers that rose without warning. Mountains that turned supply lines into riddles of mud and hunger. Early victories convinced Japanese commanders that the British could never return in force. That belief hardened into doctrine. Burma would be the shield. The Allies, they thought, lacked the strength or the will to pierce it. But the shield began cracking in 1943. Across the border in India, a massive rebuilding effort took shape. The Indian Army expanded, retrained, and re-equipped. Jungle warfare schools drilled men to move silently through bamboo and elephant grass. New supply methods transformed the region. Airdrops, aerial evacuation, portable bridges, mule columns threading through terrain previously written off on maps. And over all of this stood General William Slim, reshaping the 14th Army from a battered, underfed force into one capable of sustained offensive action. At the same time, Japan's position weakened. Its air power thinned. Its fuel reserves shrank. Its units in Burma fought malaria more often than the enemy. Supplies trickled in at a fraction of what Tokyo promised. Gaps opened between divisions and corps, patched only by orders to hold at all costs. By late 1944, the balance was no longer shifting. It had shifted. The turning point came with a series of reversals that Japan could neither absorb nor explain away. The Yugo offensive of 1944, Japan's ambitious attempt to smash into India and trigger a political collapse, ended not in triumph, but in catastrophe. At Imphal and Kohima, Japanese divisions bled themselves dry against entrenched Allied positions supplied entirely by air. The defeat shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility in the jungle. It also cost them the initiative forever. From that moment, the 14th Army pressed forward with a momentum Japan could not match. Allied logistics became a weapon. Transport aircraft lifted food, ammunition, and fuel directly to frontline units. Armored columns moved along newly repaired roads, pushing through regions Japan once considered natural fortresses. Engineers carved supply routes where Japanese maps showed only blank space. Every mile advanced widened the gulf between what Japan needed and what it could field. Inside the Burmese High Command, the mood changed. Reports from northern sectors spoke of units reduced to fractions. Officers described battalions surviving on handfuls of rice. Communications faltered. Entire regiments disappeared into jungle marches, never reaching their destinations. Japan's 15th Army, once the spearhead of conquest, now fought in fragments. As Allied forces closed on Mandalay, Japanese headquarters in Rangoon debated strategy with growing urgency. Some argued for a final stand, others pressed for withdrawal toward Thailand. None could agree. The one constant was the sense of tightening pressure. The 14th Army was not simply advancing, it was enveloping, bypassing strong points, cutting off lifelines, forcing decisions faster than Japan could react. By early 1945, the pattern was unmistakable. British Indian forces were no longer returning to Burma. They were taking it back piece by piece, and they were doing it faster than anyone in Tokyo believed possible. The noose around central Burma had begun to close. For the officers stationed across Burma in early 1945, the collapse was not abstract. It was personal, physical, and immediate. Japanese units faced a reality far removed from the confident planning tables of 1942. Supply convoys no longer reached their destinations. Ammunition arrived in half loads, or not at all. Soldiers marched barefoot on jungle tracks, their uniforms rotting from constant rain. Fevers spread faster than reinforcements. Some battalions lost more men to disease than to British fire. Frontline officers reported an enemy they had not expected. The Allied troops advancing through Burma were not the same forces they had routed in the early days of the war. These men were fitter, better fed, and armed with weapons Japan struggled to match. They moved with confidence, backed by artillery that could be redirected within minutes. When Allied aircraft appeared, Japanese commanders understood there would be no counterstroke from the sky. Their own air support had thinned to a shadow. Tactically, the shock ran even deeper. Japan's defensive assumptions, terrain, weather, jungle thickness, began to fail. The British Indian formations moved through mud the Japanese believed impassable. Columns advanced along tracks that had not existed the month before. When Japanese scouts reported armored vehicles in areas they were certain armor could never approach, senior officers dismissed the reports as errors until the engines came within hearing distance. At Meiktila and Mandalay, Japanese headquarters received field messages that described the same pattern again and again. Allied units bypassing strong points, cutting roads without formal assaults, appearing at unexpected junctions as if materializing out of the jungle. Commanders wrote later that they felt the ground shifting beneath them, a sense that the battlefield was no longer predictable. And as Japan's perimeter shrank, their assessments grew unusually candid. Officers spoke of exhaustion, of the creeping sense that their army, once feared for its endurance, was being outmatched by opponents who had learned, adapted, and now advanced with relentless precision. For the British Indian forces, the jungle demanded everything. Each step was measured against hidden rivers, sudden mudslides, and the ever-present threat of snipers. Gurkhas, Sikhs, and British infantry moved with a rhythm learned in months of careful training, where every patrol could be a fight for survival. Artillery support arrived from positions carved out under relentless rain, each gun emplacement a temporary fortress in a hostile, breathing landscape. Supply aircraft dropped rations and ammunition with surgical precision, bridging gaps that once stalled entire campaigns. Leadership decisions defined every advance. Slim orchestrated his forces like a conductor, balancing aggression with caution. Intelligence from scouts and local populations allowed columns to avoid traps, while engineers improvised bridges and cleared jungle tracks at astonishing speed. Mobility became the weapon. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized static strongpoints and decisive counterattacks, Allied forces flowed around the enemy, cutting lines of retreat, forcing redeployment, and isolating units far from support. The Japanese retreat intensified the moral strain. Units fleeing through the jungle were fragmented, hungry, and dispirited. Commanders faced impossible choices: hold an exposed village or abandon it to save manpower, counterattack with depleted ammunition, or concede ground. Reports from prisoners and captured documents later revealed a recurring theme. Japanese generals were stunned by the resilience, coordination, and audacity of a force they had underestimated for years. Technological constraints shaped every encounter. Allied use of motor transport and air supply reduced the friction of distance, while Japanese reliance on foot marches over treacherous terrain created a widening gap. Radios carried news too late to be actionable, and field intelligence was often outdated the moment it arrived. Each side experienced a world defined not just by bullets, but by the unforgiving intersection of jungle, monsoon, and human endurance. The cumulative effect was unmistakable. One army advancing with precision, another retreating under constant stress, both subject to the merciless logic of geography and supply. In the minds of Japanese generals, the sense of inevitability grew with every step the Allies took toward Mandalay. The fall of central Burma began not with fanfare, but with a series of shocks that shattered command and morale. Meiktila, a critical hub of roads and supply, was suddenly under threat. Japanese officers could hear the hum of engines in the distance, armored columns moving faster than maps could predict. Orders were issued, counterattacks planned, but each step faltered. Men could not reach positions in time. Ammunition ran short mid-fight. Smoke hung low over the mud, stinging eyes and noses, mingling with the smell of gunpowder and rain-soaked earth. Radio reports crackled with despair. Entire units were cut off. Roads once assumed impassable were now conduits for Allied mobility. Commanders wrote that they watched the battlefield shrink before their eyes, their lines folding like fragile paper under a weight they could not comprehend. The Japanese defensive strategy, once considered unbreakable, had become a trap. Field officers recorded small but telling moments of vulnerability. Soldiers sat shivering, soaked to the bone, writing hurried messages to families they would never see again. A company commander paused, staring at the jungle fringe, and admitted in his diary, "We have underestimated them, and now we pay." The words, stark and unembellished, reveal the human toll behind the tactical collapse. Every retreat exposed new risks. Allied artillery rained down on positions previously thought secure. Airstrikes struck columns and depots in areas Japan had assumed inaccessible. Supply lines disintegrated as engineers could no longer repair roads fast enough. The Japanese High Command realized that the collapse at Meiktila was not a temporary setback. It was the hinge on which the fate of central Burma turned. The momentum of the Allied advance became irreversible. Mandalay, the symbolic and strategic heart of Burma, teetered on the brink. Japanese units attempted desperate counterattacks, but coordination had dissolved. Soldiers moved in fragments, often unaware of neighboring units' positions. Artillery fell silent when ammunition ran out, and the dense jungle amplified every misstep, turning small errors into catastrophic losses. Japanese generals recorded the moment with rare honesty. Mutaguchi, in his post-war reflections, admitted disbelief at the speed and precision of the 14th Army. Kimura noted in communications that the Allies were everywhere at once, exploiting weaknesses that had seemed secure only days earlier. Frontline officers described watching entire columns vanish into the jungle only to reappear at unexpected junctions behind their own lines. Panic was not theatrical, it was factual, a consequence of broken communications and relentless pressure. The collapse extended beyond the battlefield. Supply depots were abandoned, vehicles left to rust in mud. Maps, records, and documents were destroyed to prevent capture. Retreating units staggered along tracks toward Thailand, moving like shadows, haunted by hunger, fever, and fear. Every step highlighted the gulf between Allied logistical prowess and Japanese improvisation. Amid the chaos, one human moment persisted. A young officer paused on a jungle ridge, watching smoke rise from Mandalay. He lowered his head, exhausted, and whispered a single line in a diary later recovered. "We cannot hold what we have lost in our minds." The admission was brief, private, yet it captured the fracture of an army and the weight of defeat in a single heartbeat. By the time Meiktila and Mandalay fell, the psychological and physical momentum had shifted entirely. Japanese command structures were fragmented, their strategy reduced to reaction and retreat. Burma was no longer a shield. It was a corridor of loss. The immediate aftermath of Burma's central collapse was stark and unrelenting. Japanese units, already exhausted from months of monsoon campaigns, faced starvation, disease, and disintegration. Hospitals overflowed with soldiers suffering from dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition. Entire battalions marched into the jungle only to dissolve into smaller, unrecorded groups, their numbers dwindling daily. Diaries and reports from the period describe men scavenging for roots, hunting small game, and drinking from stagnant pools, measures of survival rather than strategy. Commanders recorded the emotional weight of the retreat. Fear was pervasive but quiet, threaded through every message sent along unreliable lines. Officers had no illusions about the consequences of failure. The psychological toll mirrored the physical: exhaustion, despair, and the creeping acknowledgement that Burma could not be held. One field officer wrote simply, "We are beaten, but still we move." A phrase repeated in varying forms across unit logs, each echoing the grinding persistence of an army in collapse. The jungle itself became a weapon. Retreating units struggled against mud-swollen rivers and collapsing bridges. Monsoon rains erased tracks and trails, slowing withdrawal and isolating groups of soldiers. Every mile was measured in suffering, and every night brought new dangers. Disease, Allied patrols, and the uncertainty of survival. The human cost was immense, yet it was chronicled with precision in records, diaries, and intercepted communications, leaving an unflinching portrait of an army forced to reckon with failure on a massive scale. The strategic consequences rippled far beyond the suffering of individual soldiers. With Mandalay and Meiktila lost, the Burma Road reopened, restoring a vital lifeline to China and altering the broader theater of Southeast Asia. Japanese defensive networks in the region were shattered, leaving remaining forces isolated and unable to regroup. High command in Tokyo faced an unambiguous truth. Burma, once a shield for the Southern Empire, had become a corridor of vulnerability. Japanese generals reflected on the collapse with unusual candor. Post-war interrogations and diaries reveal admissions that had never been spoken in the heat of battle. Miscalculations of Allied capabilities, underestimation of Indian and British resilience, and failures to adapt doctrine to a fluid, jungle-dominated battlefield. Mutaguchi lamented that terrain once considered an ally had become a trap. Kimura conceded that the 14th Army's mobility and supply network were beyond anything Japanese planners had anticipated. Even lower-ranking officers recorded that defeat was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The human cost persisted in retreating columns. Survivors were emaciated, feverish, and mentally shattered. Many lost contact with their units entirely, wandering the jungle for days, sometimes weeks, before finding any semblance of structure. Discipline eroded. Morale collapsed. The once feared Burma Area Army existed more as a series of fragmented shadows than a cohesive force. Across the plains, villages and small towns bore witness to an army in decay, its departure leaving silence, destruction, and a bitter legacy for both occupiers and the occupied. The loss of Burma crystallized a turning point in the Southeast Asian campaign. The Allies advanced with renewed confidence, while Japanese command confronted the sobering reality of strategic overreach and misjudgment. The country that had once seemed impregnable had fallen, exposing vulnerabilities that would shape the final year of the Pacific War. Burma's jungle returned to silence after months of relentless conflict. Yet the echoes of what had passed lingered in every river bend, every scarred village, every mud-soaked trail. The 14th Army moved forward, methodical and unrelenting, while the Japanese retreat became a study in endurance and human limitation. The terrain that had once promised protection had exacted a toll greater than any battle. A toll measured in lives, in lost regiments, and in the quiet shattering of command. The capture of Burma revealed more than a shift of territory. It exposed the limits of preparation versus adaptability, of doctrine versus reality. It showed how logistics, mobility, and relentless pressure could unmake an army once thought invincible. And in the diaries, the reports, the radio intercepts, the human cost was undeniable. Fear, exhaustion, and the slow acknowledgement that the tide could not be turned. Burma became a mirror of war's truth. That strategy is only as strong as those who execute it. And that terrain, weather, and determination can bend even the most disciplined army toward defeat. The general's reflections, recorded with unusual honesty, remind us that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in glory, but in survival, learning, and the quiet weight of history pressing on all who endured. The lessons of Burma linger, silent, unyielding, and profound.